Welcome to Understandable Insights, Information to Intelligence with Sue Gordon, the national security podcast that gives you a competitive advantage, an elemental understanding of the world as it is, not how you prefer it to be. I'm Eric, joined each week by the Honorable Sue Gordon, and together we'll break down the headlines shaping our world, looking for patterns and early warning signs, and asking how we should be thinking and acting as citizens and leaders across issues in intelligence, technology, and business. It's May 18th, 2026. Let's get to it. Hey, Sue, how are you?
I'm good. I'm beaming in from Beantown this morning. I'm in Boston, and I love this city. It's like super historic and surprisingly small for a big city. So I love being in Boston. I can't wait to learn more about it. The exciting thing, though, about my Boston visit happened last night, where I get a note that I have a chance to go to the annual WBUR Bash, which is the big NPR radio station here.
Cool.
And they have an annual fundraising bash. And what it does is it celebrates journalism, both locally and nationally, and the people who make it possible. And tonight's speakers are Heather Cox Richardson and Douglas Brinkley speaking on America at 250. You and I talk about Heather Cox Richardson and her Letters from an American and how much we like her perspective as a historian here at Boston University. But Douglas Brinkley is a professor and historian at Rice. And where does he live? Our hometown, Austin. So maybe if I can find a way to meet him, maybe that becomes an interesting conversation for us. Anyway, America at 250, what a great topic. I was trying to do some research on Douglas Brinkley, but I learned a fun fact. In fourth grade, he learned all the presidents and vice presidents in order. So I learned all the presidents in order in fifth grade. So, he and I are destined to meet, I feel. So I know.
And the vice presidents?
And he also memorized who they ran against. So he's like way better than I am. But I feel oddly a kindred spirit with him. Would you like me to recite them in order? No? Anyway.
The vice presidents in order? That's a deep pull.
Yeah, it is a deep pull.
That's some good trivia knowledge right there.
Anyway, the other thing, you're living in the future when Texans are now debating whether ChatGPT is drinking all the water. Did you see this thing? This University of Texas study that was just released that said by 2040, data centers in the state of Texas could account for 3 to 9% of Texas water. That's craziness. And, we're going to talk about cyber and we're going to build this story that, it's AI, is it software, it's land use, it's water policy, it's energy policy, and then it's national security policy. But the real top line of that one is, national security is increasingly going to be defined by small town county commissioners. Think about that, right? These big issues, when they aggregate, are being decided at the local level, which is kind of our thesis of citizens have to be involved. I will also say that we've spent 20 years talking about how the information economy is weightless, and that's a pretty heavy thought. What's on your mind?
I've got a kindergarten graduation later today, which on the one hand, proud of my son. On the other hand, it's like at 8:15, and then there's an expectation to take them home after. And then there's also, are we going to be doing this every year? We did preschool graduation last year, which makes sense because he was leaving his preschool, but now it's kindergarten. It's like, dude, I got some more shit to do. We got to isolate some of these events and celebrate sparingly. What's your take on some of that?
I don't know. I'm not totally sure I went to kindergarten. I seem to recall that it was a optional thing.
Yeah.
I don't remember any graduations until I graduated from high school.
Right?
And I don't really remember my parents coming to school for field days or Thanksgiving. And I'm not saying that was a better way, but man, it just seems too much. And it feels like it almost has a dilutive effect even within the microcosm of that expectation.
Yeah. And it's also like game theory. None of us could go, and then none of the kids get offended because their parents aren't going. But if one of us parents go, then it's, why didn't my mom and dad come, right? And the prisoner's dilemma of, hey, we could all get $500 if no one fesses up, or if one person can take the whole loot and none of us get anything.
Yeah, I mean, I really love the participative aspect of it and children learning that the things they're doing are important to their parents. And I think it's fun to celebrate and see your kids. But and just think about the people that are working jobs that they can't take off. And then what does that signal? Anyway, it's kind of like hierarchical and matrix organizations. It's like you realize the deficiency of one way of doing things, and then you overcorrect till the other way of doing things, and then you have to correct back to a different way of doing things. But
Yep.
God bless you.
Graduation day.
I'm not so upset about the graduation. I'm just thinking about what it would have done to me if I had to pick my kids up from school at 8:30 in the morning on a school day for me. You know,
On
on a
a
work day.
Monday, dude. On a Monday. Ay, ay, ay.
Ay, ay, ay. Anyway, I think it's cathartic to talk about it.
So I'm going to complain
And
about it here. Yeah,
yeah, that's exactly right. And then you'll
exactly.
be excited for your kids. That's really funny. We're going to get cards and letters over this one, Eric. We're seeming like very ogreish people.
Well, you're in Boston. You channel some Bill Belichick. Just do your
Yeah.
job.
Just do your job.
All right.
What do you need? Hey, we didn't talk about Caitlin Clark. Move on.
There you go. Before we jump into number 2 in our series, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Trump-Xi summit. So last week's Trump-Xi summit in Beijing was framed publicly as a step towards strategic stability, with the White House touting new trade and investment boards. Chinese commitments to buy Boeing aircraft and U.S. soybeans and other agricultural products, renewed market access for American beef, and movement on rare earth supply concerns. But the major takeaway is that nothing really happened. The Financial Times notes the commercial wins were narrower than billed, and the U.S. declined to extend the broader trade war truce for the remainder of Trump's term in order to preserve leverage. Fox News reviewed the summit through a harder national security lens, arguing that the meeting exposed, not resolved, the new Cold War dynamic around Taiwan, Iran, and AI competition. And meanwhile, the New York Times and Atlantic emphasized a point you've made since January. U.S. commitments under Trump are transactional and reversible, raising questions about how partners interpret any U.S.-China bargain. So, Sue, the White House is pointing to Boeing, agriculture, beef, then these new trade and investment boards. Are those real strategic stability gains, as they call them, or are we mistaking national security progress for transactional?
I knew we were going to talk about this, and yet as I listened to you, I kind of changed my talking point. If you're a farmer or a plant worker for Boeing, each of those things are real, I think. Maybe will have some impact. So presuming that they actually manifest, even though they are not strategically significant in terms of their dollar value. You know, it's not the largest aircraft deal ever. It's not more soybeans than we've ever sold. It doesn't eliminate our dependence on rare earths. To the extent that there is something to them, I suppose that it's real-ish on that front. And I think we talk about how do we want people to read news stories? And our first question is always, what problem is actually being solved? I really have no idea. I kind of think that what really came out of it was that President Trump was able to continue to advance his comms strategy, that he is doing good things, and that he is continuing something that he's actually said for both administrations is that he will talk to anybody because we must be able to talk to anybody. And I think that's probably true. So I think from the president's perspective, that's probably what it achieved. I think if you look beyond the story, kind of the theme of our podcast, boy, some of the nothing that happened, some of the top line conversations, even those that Fox News talks about, I think the big geopolitical issues were a huge loss for the United States. I was on with Nicole Wallace the other day, and I said, my biggest takeaway is it sounds like the United States has switched sides. The president's commentary on Taiwan, to me, was Yeah, I'm really uninterested in this small, insignificant island to me getting involved in a land war in Asia and causing me to have to go 10,000 miles to bail it out. And so I'm not super interested. To me, that is a mind blowing statement. On the other hand, I think we probably ought to have a national conversation about whether Taiwan is important to us because Xi will at some point seek to reunify and we ought to know what we're gonna do about it, but the signaling that came with the yeah, I don't know, that's important, is weirdly the same signaling that kind of is around Ukraine, which is, "Yeah, why do we care? That's not our war, that's your war." Where, almost as a predicate of the United States positioning in the old world order, we were the insurers of sovereignty, and you can't be big and just take small, and free trade and freedom of navigation. Those things are important. If you look at some of these conversations, it just feels like we flipped to the other side of that argument. How do you read that?
Yeah, I think the comms and PR strategy is really important. If you're a candidate running for reelection in a predominantly agriculture, rancher state, and you're backed by President Trump, and you can go out there now and say President Trump and MAGA went to China
Yep,
and advocated for you. I think your point about these are not insignificant gains to the individual and to the farmer. I
that's
don't
right.
know that we'll see them in the next 6 months before November, but these are great headlines for an election going in that we are advocating for our constituents. As far as nothing happening, I guess we should be glad that we didn't
Right.
give away the farm on the one hand, right? We had apprehension last week. We had reservations that, hey, I don't think we're in a great place with negotiations and we're going to be trying to strike a grand bargain. So I don't know that we got our hat handed to us in that sense.
There has been some talk about he was gonna be seeking a multi-trillion-dollar investment in the United States, and I won't say that you and I were panicking, but we certainly saw that just in terms of historically, to presume that China's interest in investing in America was interested in investing in America. No, it was interested in investing in itself, and what we knew what would happen if they established more footholds, had more control over technologies and infrastructure. So I think you're right, is that's what we were braced for, and that didn't happen. And so I think that's probably pretty good.
The shifting narrative of what you said about Taiwan, calling Xi a friend, my good friend, and then also just some of the reactions. I know there's video circulating of Secretary Rubio looking around and being mesmerized by some of the architecture and some of the design. If you're the team and the staff there, I would have expected you to have significant bearing, right? Inside your own head, being like, wow, this is really impressive and cool, but not give the Chinese propaganda machine or the Chinese government any ammunition there to say that, yeah, we're crushing it.
From an intelligence officer perspective, it was a little obsequious for my tastes. That's how I view it, is we don't want to appear weak, even though I totally agree that we have to have relations with global players. Weirdly, it's almost like both sides got what they wanted. And do I think that it moved the needle tremendously? No. We talk about how you read a story, what incentives are driving the behavior. I think we just named them.
Hmm.
Having something to say. You named it with the election. What I'm talking about are the second order effects. And I think for even what the president was trying to achieve in terms of economic impact, we talked about what assumptions have to be true. The localities are going to be the ones, and the voters in those localities are the ones that decide whether they see a benefit or whether they don't see a benefit. But from a PR perspective, in an information environment where the statement is easier to make than the effect to see, I think it probably had some benefit
Yep.
to him and to the constituencies that he was trying to address. How about that?
I agree. And maybe this is naively optimistic, but how closely he's aligned himself with many of these tech leaders and how involved he's been in AI policy or allowing his administration to push AI policy and things. TSMC
Yeah.
and how critical Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Center is to our goals I don't know, does that add to strategic ambiguity, or these comments
Oh,
change that positioning?
yeah. So to me, this gives them a little more strategic clarity that we're not going to rock the boat on China policy. Their intelligence services are saying, yeah, the U.S. is not in as strong a position as it has been in the past. And it is going to want to not create a moment of choice. It's going to want to go along to get along so I can continue to press that. So China comes away with saying, we know a little bit more about what the U.S. is willing to do. She comes out and basically says you're a declining power, and don't you realize we're an ascendant power, and you better watch your step because history talks about what happens to ruling powers that don't pay attention to ascendant powers, and we say nothing. The president basically just lets that lie on the ground. I think they learned a lot from that. On the other hand, we've talked in these stories about the second and third order effect. He didn't make any agreements that change who owns the infrastructure. Now, he did say he didn't challenge the fact that China feels perfectly comfortable stealing our intellectual property. He hasn't given them control over who controls the standards. He didn't make any agreements on that. On the other hand, non-participation, if you just look in the context of the way the world is going, the U.S. not aggressively participating in any of those things and drawing lines in the sand on infrastructure or standards or supply chains or data access or logistics supply. It does seem that we're not going to make that something we're going to insist on. And then if you just look at the trend lines, China's winning on those fronts. So tactically, probably okay. Strategically, time's going to tell, but it feels like China gained insight into what this administration is going to be willing to do.
Yep. We'll keep an eye on it. Let's transition over to cyber. And what are we going to talk about today?
Cyber today is less about breaking into systems than shaping the systems that societies become dependent upon. Probably 15 years ago, I said we were going to stop talking about cyber because cyber was nothing more than the modality by which age-old intentions are going to be affected. And so I think the digital era, strategic power increasingly comes from influencing the systems that societies depend upon. And so we want to reframe the cyber conversation from the technical that is really just about theft or espionage and disruption. And so we're going to try and show how war zones are shifting and that there are new threat surfaces and that this strategic terrain is trust. And I just need to reiterate the point about trust and why we are disproportionately more vulnerable as a free and open society to assaults on trust because we default to trust in a way that autocracies and closed systems do not. And so that shift, if it is eroded, takes away perhaps the greatest power of a democracy in our republic, which is the ability for the engine of society to be constantly learning and growing and testing and understanding at speed rather than being constrained to an environment that is dictated to it. That's what we hope we're going to do is we're going to take cyber from a technical thing and from a series of events into let's talk about its insinuation into our systems and consequently affecting that which we depend upon in order to run as a society.
Let's get to it. When most people think about cybersecurity, they think about hackers and firewalls, who's getting in and how we keep them out. But the real attack surface in 2026 isn't a network perimeter, it's societal dependence. The things we can't function without are cloud, ports, logistics networks, GPS, energy grids, identity systems, payment rails, hospitals, telecom, the list goes on. These aren't just targets, they're the load-bearing walls of modern life, And an attacker doesn't need to destroy them, they just need to make you doubt whether they're working correctly. So you talked before about the Colonial pipeline hack and how that wasn't really about the pipeline. So when you look at the list of things society depends on, what's the question you're asking?
What's connected to what and what society can't function without? And I'll talk about Colonial Pipeline in a second because I want to talk about how we reacted to it and what happened because of it. But I just want to bounce back to Russia and Ukraine in 2014, where Russia was basically able to, through digital means, shut down Ukraine's power infrastructure. Yes, it could do that, but that's not really what it was about. It was basically about teaching Ukraine that Russia had power over them and foment the angst of whether we're safe and whether we've been incurred upon. And it turns out they did ultimately physically as well. But to me, that was just such a great example of it felt like it was about taking away power, but it was more about we own you. Now, interestingly enough, by doing that in 2014, if we looked at the Ukraine war, one of the things that was really astounding that was not particularly well protected is Ukraine having learned that lesson. By the time Russia invades again in 2022 in a meaningful way, they had actually done a lot of exercising on the resilience of their systems and the interdependence between society and what they depended on and how they rebuilt their systems against it. So one of the problems, if you do it right, is you see these things coming and then you make yourselves more resilient. In other words, in the Ukraine war, and we don't talk much about this, Russia continued to attack the information infrastructure, but that was never the story, right?
Hmm.
The story we now have of Ukraine is just how resilient they've been kind of on every front, but they were especially resilient on the information front. Even though they were attacked and things kept on going down, the truth is they had developed a mechanism and an infrastructure that allowed attack, but still allowed functioning. And so I think the lesson for us is when we see cyber activities, and whether you are looking at national security or whether you are a company looking at what you need to protect in your information space or whether you're a citizen, the same thing I want people to ask themselves, whatever domain you're working is, what must you have and what can you not have happen? And we just talked about Ukraine. Colonial Pipeline is another great example where, interesting, the hackers got into the business systems, but because they were in the business systems, you know who shut down the pipeline and caused the energy hiccup? We did, the owners of Colonial Pipeline. So unprepared for the attack were they, that when the business systems were compromised, they were desperately afraid that the whole thing would go down, so they shut it down. If I'm the
Preemptively.
hackers, I'm like, "Score," right? I've achieved the effect, and I didn't actually have to do that. So to me, that's just a super example of no matter how protected they were, and no matter how isolated the operating versus the business systems were, when it came to an attack, they weren't prepared to both see and make decisions. And to me, it's less about the actions you should take when you understand where your vulnerabilities are and more about understanding the vulnerabilities because you can prepare things. So you named a lot of it before: cloud services, GPS. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Yeah, think about that. And it's every system that we have. And GPS is one of my favorite. Everything now depends on location services. And I'm not sure anyone younger than you can read a map, right?
I completely agree. There's a episode of Bluey we've been watching recently, and the dad loses his sat nav in Australia, his GPS. He has no idea how to get to his kid's school. He's navigated on his phone around his town as long as they've lived there, and he doesn't actually know where any of the things are. And so it's a story of going to all the different places and asking people, and they're like, "You don't know where your son's school is?" And they're just like, "No, I don't have GPS."
Right. We know that adversaries and competitors have the ability and have positioned themselves to be able to do something against GPS. We know that they haven't, but they do. And both Russia and China have their own on-orbit satellite
Hmm.
navigation system. So on the day they decided to, they can use theirs and we don't have access to ours. And again, it's not that you can't figure out what to do about it. You have to imagine not having it because you cannot do enough technical work to defend every avenue for attack. You have to say, what must I have? And then you have to look at it to make sure that it's resilient. And sometimes resilience is you can do it without the computer system. Now, when we get to big national systems like telecommunications and payment rails and hospital systems, those are just much bigger. And this is where I think the US has kind of a interesting security and vulnerability at the same time. I know this from being a cyber operator. It's really hard to achieve systemic effects. And in the United States, since everyone can build their own, there's some security in the diversity of our systems. It would hard to take everything down. But on the other hand, because we don't insist on the standards by which our critical infrastructure, which is what? Transportation, electricity, telecommunications, health systems, are all protected. We don't have a standard by which they ought to be protected. We're kind of leaving ourselves vulnerable and you can't predict the ripple effects. And so now I need all those people, those county commissioners we just talked about in Texas. What are they doing to ensure the resilience of that infrastructure? I think this mind shift that we need to go through, almost regardless of the domain of your responsibility, all the way from the nation down to the household, is what do you need to be able to do and how can you assure that you're going to be able to do it? Thinking about you talking about parents, there are a whole bunch of high schoolers that absolutely count on being able to see whether their kids have turned in assignments so they know whether they're going to have to repeat senior English. And wasn't there a story just a while ago that Canvas went down, the big kind of grading lecture infrastructure that so
Hmm.
many
Yeah.
universities use?
Yep.
It seized it up. It's a cyber thing, but the effect, because it happened right around exams, you have a whole bunch of things that need to happen. So to me, yes, it's oftentimes a technological problem, but you can't solve it by protecting all the technology. You have to think about what you're depending on and then ensure that you can do that, not ensure that all the technology is in place. And they're intertwined.
Yeah. And the attack surface is everything we depend on, right? We had that list of things, and that's not even totally enumerated. This is a shift from defense to continuity, though. And
Right.
the old cyber question was, can you stop every intrusion, right? Put up a good firewall. But the new question is, can society continue functioning under that pressure? And you've said before, offense beats defense. The question is whether your systems, your organizations, and your society can absorb the hit and keep operating. So, have some organizations or companies that you've seen already make that shift, and how have they been successful doing that?
Yeah. So for a bit, the most successful were the ones that understood that this was an attack surface and not just on the network itself, but the data that was basically traveling across the network. And you've seen a whole industries grow up around cybersecurity and data protection. And we've made headway in a really weird way that you even see ransomware now. I still believe that you can't negotiate with terrorists and you have a ransomware attack. You shouldn't pay the criminal who's stealing it because you can't guarantee whether they're in your network still and you can't guarantee what they'll do with the data that they've stolen. But the truth is there's been enough of an advance that companies now, a huge fraction of people who are victims of a ransomware attack pay it off and move forward because they've figured out how to isolate it and they figured out what the relative impact on their overall performance has been. We know the areas that need to be protected. We are an absolutely amazing innovation ecosystem that is continually coming up with new products and services that are more and more close to resilience. Zero trust architecture was an advance in that. So the ones that are good at it have moved along with the understanding of where the attacks are and taking advantage of the technologies and the wisdom that comes along. Problem with even that is, man, it's a lot of money.
Yeah.
And now you're seeing companies saying, "Man, where does this end? How much can I spend?" Because the truth is we still have significant cyber attacks, whether it's of an airline or something like that. You're seeing more people exercise, more people ask the question of risk. You see a lot of moves to go to centralization, not because central things are necessarily more secure, but because you can monitor and update them more. So a lot of those things are true. I again say, though, if we think we have seen the limits of what adversaries and competitors could do to the environment, I don't think we have. And AI has really introduced a whole nother set of concerns that I have. And that is when you start going to agentic work, what are those agents doing for you and what pathways are they opening up? And then we've talked about Mythos, where it was discovered that Mythos, something that had great positive potential, actually had created a pathway for really profound effect in the hands of adversaries. Gets understanding of where your risk is and then just continue to move resilience. I'm pretty sure we don't exercise enough, and I'm pretty sure there's still a gap from big organizational risk and then big organizational action. I think where we're going to see a lot of progress made, though, is in financial services. It has always been on the forefront of really
Hmm.
looking at security. And because the world depends on a good, sound financial infrastructure, I think both you're going to see a lot of cooperation internationally to try and make sure it's protected and a lot of effort by financial services to make sure that they are maintaining trust, recognizing that they're not moving money. They're basically selling trust.
If I understand this correctly, the shift from defense to continuity, that's reasonable, right? We're going to have a
Right.
nice solid firewall, but we also have this mentality shift that we expect that the perpetrators will get into our network. So that means we have to constantly monitor and we have to have surveillance systems in place to be prepared to detect them. Are we ready for this surveillance, the intrusion, and the subsequent lack of privacy inherent in that type of defense system? Or how do you envision that working?
So we're still kind of same domaining it. In other words, I have network, so I'm going to put on network defense. I'm moving things technically, so I'm going to come up with technical solutions. I am concerned about deep fakes, which is a different kind of cyber intrusion. And so I'm going to really work hard on more anti deep fake technology. What we know instead is that it is really pretty easy to be surreptitious and avoid detection if you're in a single domain, and really hard to avoid detection if you do cross domain. So, what I mean by this is, yeah, you can have bad guys. And again, those are competitors or adversaries for lots of different purposes, or people who just want to disrupt voting systems. You can have them notionally getting into a system, and it's going to be hard to always detect technically. But this is where counterintelligence and looking at personnel security comes in, right?
Hmm.
Are the behaviors right? Is the right person doing something? Who's on that system? And physical, who gets onto your compound? What are your mechanisms by which people can physically get access to the computer system? And when it comes to deep fakes, yes, that is, you could probably make a video of me saying anything. I've been horrifyingly too overexposed in the digital universe, but I'm not sure you could always make something credibly of me saying something in a particular time or in a particular space. So I think where we haven't really thought about is getting beyond just technical solutions to what seems like a technical problem and saying, how are the other ways I might detect what is reasonable behavior or not by just staying in the technical domain, but by looking at the actors. Most cyber actors do not actually just technically penetrate. Usually they have some sort of assistance where someone clicks on a spam a phishing note or a human is convinced to do something that they would never do. So I think the real solution to some of this is to add on top of it, again, understanding the overall vulnerability, all the ecosystem that contributes to trust, right? So that's different. It's not all the things that contribute to your network, but rather all the things that contribute to trust, and see if there are other ways you can look for other behaviors. And some companies do it well by exercising and basically wargaming and putting a red team against it. And red teams are notoriously devious, and they come up with ways that the game didn't have a rule to cover, and so they do something, and that's how they learn. I'm more worried actually about just individuals because now everyone is so connected. All the people working at home, everyone that has access, everyone goes into their banking system, right? If
Hmm.
they aren't protected, if their identity isn't assured, if they aren't careful about what they have, then kind of the whole thing is compromised in non-predictive ways.
Yeah, so then it becomes even more important to be able to identify people and authenticate them, right? Whether they're on your team or how they clicked on a link. And that's not the deep technical discussion about identity management. It's about identity as the control plane of modern life. Whoever controls identity controls access, and whoever controls access controls outcomes. We talked in episode 41 about how individuals give away permissions without understanding them, but this is the same problem at the infrastructure level. If identity is the control plane, who's controlling it?
You said it in your intro of how much we give away of our stuff
Mm,
for the issue of speed and convenience. And that is, I don't want to be inconvenienced. Why are you making me show another ID? I was frustrated yesterday because the line at TSA pre was super long, and I'm like, "Ugh." And now they have a shorter line for TSA touchless, and I'm like, ugh, how do I do that? And so I tried to get onto my app and change that security permissions by loading in documents, and it wanted my passport information. And I'm like, I don't have my passport with me because it wanted me to scan my passport, but I do have a picture of my passport, but it wouldn't accept it. And I was so mad. And I'm like, wait, right? As the things we want to do become so enabled, but the things we need to do in order to assure that identity piece that is weirdly fundamental to free and open societies. We've talked about the information space, right? And just how it vexes me that I have no idea what true information is anywhere. And some of that is just because junk is being put into the system. Some is because we're being shaped by adversaries and competitors. And some is just because I want to believe what I want to believe. But one of the things that I chafe at in terms of control is content control. Because in a free and open society, anyone should be allowed to say anything, except perhaps if they own public office, and then they probably shouldn't be lying about things. But if that is true in an open society, then being able to know that the information, whether you like it or not, is true, that is, you can trace its pedigree to something withstanding, is really essential to achieving both the speed of action and the trust in the action. And that today is incredibly manual and takes consent. And how do we put that in place so that people can participate? We want participation and not be constrained, but that's a system that depends on millions of individual actions can still be depended on. And you want an example of that tension? Voter ID, right?
yeah.
There's a great argument that says we need to be able to trust our system. And then there's another great argument that says, whoa, are you asking so much? And is it so hard that you're actually choosing a way by which you will limit participation? That's why I think identity continues to be one of the most important elements for open societies is that we solve this because we depend on it to work. And yet we also depend on it not to exclude that which shouldn't be excluded. And so To the average bear, don't chafe at being asked to prove. But to those who are designing new systems to be able to work at volume and speed, be careful that you don't put things in place that exclude what you need. So when you read stories about the Save America Act, and when you read stories about, I don't want to have to show ID or I do want to give away my information, that's what you should look into. And when you want to understand whether you should care, decide how important the system is to either your functioning or to societal functioning. And I think you'll say, well, we need to know more about that.
So we've gone from dependence to continuity to identity, and every one of those lands on the same thing. The traditional framing of conflict is about territory, who controls the land, the sea lanes, the airspace, and the cyber framing is shifted to networks, who controls the digital infrastructure. But the real strategic terrain in 2026 is trust. And trust once lost is the hardest thing to rebuild. When U.S. commitments are transactional and reversible, trust erodes. When AI systems are deployed without accountability, trust erodes. And when identity infrastructure is compromised, trust erodes. The adversary doesn't need to destroy your systems, as you said. They just need to make your people doubt them. So, what's the question we should be asking ourselves as citizen leaders across issues in intelligence, technology, and business?
We've talked a little bit about how you ask the questions of the articles that you
Yeah,
read. And we've talked a bit about how you understand for yourself where your dependencies are. And when I say yourself, it depends on the role you play. We all have lots of different personas in our lives. So an elected
right.
official, the head of an agency, the head of a company, all the way down. Maybe the best way to break that down is to say, okay, let's talk about some of the questions citizens should ask, right? If there's a cyber incident, and this is whether you're reading a news article or whether you're talking to your elected representative who's standing up in front of you telling them why you don't have power. Ask what dependency is being targeted. And don't talk to me about the technical details of the attack. What aren't we going to be able to do, and how are you going to bring those things up? Were they going after the data? Or are they trying, like in Ukraine in 2014, trying to make us not believe in our systems? And ask who benefits and what happens and how long is it going to be down? And then after a cyber incident, yes, same thing. As you're talking about it, is what are you going to do about that? How are we going to make sure that that dependency isn't going to be attacked again? So I think when you have events, if you want to bounce up to national security, understand what somebody is trying to do in a larger sense. And if you want to be locally responsible, say, how are you going to fix this? What do you now understand? What's the ecosystem that's involved? What are the non-technical actions that we need to take in order to resolve it? We live in Texas, Eric. I think most of the time our electrical grid is brought down by weather. That's random, and look what it does. What if someone just decided, as we build out the Texas Innovation Center and we're hugely successful with building the new American model for modern healthcare in America that overcomes all the health disparities? You think that's not an attractive target, whether it is from the research that is powering the decisions they're making to creating terror events when the hospital goes down? So as you look at that thing that becomes a really interesting new dependence, are the people that are building it taking this into account? And are they protecting it newly? So I think one of the really interesting things is if you see that this is really a trust and dependence, anytime there's a new big target, instead of just thinking about all its potential, think about its vulnerability and then ask the questions whether the people that are doing it, building it, introducing it, expecting you to count on it, wanting you to pay for it, are also assuring that it's going to be there when you need it. And then you can keep building on to questions for leaders and representatives. How is it changing what your priorities are? Where do you think we have to have national standards? Do you really want every business to be able to make decisions for their own? Back to my water example in Texas, we're going to have all these data centers. To what standards are they going to be protected? When all the data in Texas, when all decisions are being made by the AI capabilities that are resident there, is being housed there, what are they doing to assure that it's going to be there? And mostly, you're just saying, hey, are we optimizing purely for efficiency or profit or for resilience? And I trust that with that perspective, things could get better without necessarily having to fix them after the fact. The problem is there's no weight to networks and information, that it'll all just happen and it's all just positive benefit. And now what we're seeing is, no, it does end up having physical and systemic effect at the most profound level in open societies, which is dependence and trust.
What else are you watching?
Yeah, so I guess right now my big thing is I'm watching what I perceive to be growing instability around our elections, whether it's the redistricting fights or the court interventions or the changing voting rules or disputes over legitimacy. We have like a whole bunch of states right now, Tennessee and Georgia and South Carolina and Louisiana and Florida and Virginia are all in motion. And I saw this soundbite that said the National Conference of State Legislatures noted that the scale of mid-decade restructuring underway now has not been seen since the 1800s. So much so that many localities are having to reschedule primaries because of all the rule changes in the district that they're considering. And so the big kind of meta question is, are the rules going to stay stable enough to allow elections? And I believed this in 2016 when we were, perish the thought, surprised by Russian attempts to influence our election, that democracies depend on trusted systems and stable rules and shared legitimacy. And once citizens begin believing the rules themselves are endlessly adjustable, depending on who has power or just whatever perspective someone's coming from, the institutional trust erodes. And so I just think this voting thing, just temporally as well, because we have midterms coming up, is a really interesting question about, does the process of putting every rule in question actually undermine legitimacy, which seems antithetical or counterintuitive. So that's my big thing that I'm watching now. How about you?
I think now that the Xi-Trump summit is over, I'm interested to see what attention gets placed back on Iran and whether there's anything new there. Also, not forgetting that Israel has their priorities, so that's going to play a huge role in any negotiation.
Yeah, I was kind of horrified on that front that we have no idea what's going on in Iran. We've forgotten about Venezuela. Ukraine is still sitting there, and the president brings up Cuba. You're going to have to fix Cuba. And I'm just like...
That's right.
And it just feels like we're getting inured to this notion that we just initiate something and it's a hot mess, but we walk away without ever resolving it. I do think Iran is going to have to be addressed because the Strait is really a problem. If that doesn't get resolved, the global economic situation, including here in the United States, is going to get worse in the short haul.
I almost forgot about the strike in Nigeria, too. Taking out ISIS number 2. Back to the Sahel. Let's go.
How to make sense of it. And the only thing I'll say is it's a little bit about this tension because it can't be everything and it can't be nothing. Not everything's going to become a world war and not everything is going to become just a strike. How do we know which is which and who's thinking about the second and third order effects of this? My big second, third order effect is the world is rewiring based on the perception of the U.S. not being that stable influence of the rule of law that it has been in the past. So that's the other big poles of a new world order are fixing their positions while we're out there just creating chaos.
That's what we're watching and how we see it. Thank you for joining us.
That was depressing as I'll get at. Sorry about that, team.
No doubt there's more to come. Just a big crazy world. I'm just trying to understand it. This country's strength isn't in its power, industry, or government, but in its people.
And that is 100% true. So thanks for joining us. We love to hear what you think of our direction, focus, and insights. As always, it's the conversation we're trying to start and inspire and hopefully advance. And we're always open for you to tell us how we can better serve you. So join us next week and each week for the Understandable Insights podcast, wherever you listen. And as always, go forth, do good, and for goodness sakes, to be kind to one another because it really does matter.